Hey everyone, it's Sciortino here, the writer and director of Paper Crane. This video I'm going to be sharing some resources for trauma survivors and some information about different types of trauma. First thing I'd like to say is that if you are experiencing a crisis or trauma at this moment, please do pause the video, and if you're in the US, you can call the Rape and Abuse Incest National Network, or RAIN. Their number is easily accessible on Google, or you can text the crisis hotline, which is 741-741. A volunteer will text you right back. There's also the resource called 1 in 6, which is for men and male identified survivors of trauma. And if you're outside the US, just Google a trauma crisis helpline. I'm sure there's one in your area. Please do get the help that you need. If you're not in an immediate crisis, thanks for coming on to this video to talk about some different types of trauma. I do want to give a little bit of a trigger warning. I will be listing a few different types of trauma in this video. So if you need to pause and just do something to take care of yourself, please do so as well. So the first distinction I would like to make, you may have seen this circulating on the internet or not, is this idea between what they call big T or capital T trauma and little t trauma. And this is not to diminish any type of trauma at all. It's just to distinguish certain types of events from others, and I'll be talking a little bit about why that is. So a big T trauma is anything that might be life-threatening. It's a very serious removal of autonomy. So in this situation, we might be talking about war, being involved in a shooting, about rape, a traumatic accident, or even a life-threatening illness. There are many different types of big T trauma, and my guess is that if you have experienced one, you probably know, and if that is the case, I'm so sorry. Just know that I'm with you, and I'm going to be sharing some resources for healing of those big traumas. Secondly, we have our little t traumas, and the reason that I want to talk about these is that I do think sometimes they get a little bit swept under the rug in certain situations, even in therapeutic environments. And little t traumas might be perhaps less life-threatening events, but they do still involve a removal of autonomy and kind of a loss of a sense of self, a sense of feeling safe in the world, and sometimes they can occur repeatedly over long periods of time. So examples of little t trauma might be racial microaggressions, might be childhood abuse, even verbal abuse like criticism, or even just living with a perfectionist parent, bullying, harassment, illnesses, injuries. What we found about these things is that over time, they actually have a similar effect on the nervous system to big T traumas. And so you might see these things referred to as, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as relating to a big T trauma, one large event, or you might see CPTSD, and that refers to complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And complex PTSD is something that occurs when perhaps one event can't be pinpointed, but the person is still experiencing similar symptoms like feeling unsafe in the world, feeling unsafe in their bodies, and even other disorders related to nervous system dysregulation. So dysregulation is when the nervous system can't regulate itself to feeling safe, to feeling a baseline of what's called colloquially as the rest and digest mode. You might be stuck in your fight, flight, or freeze response. Nervous system dysregulation has been linked back to many different nervous system disorders, including ADHD, OCD, chronic unexplained pain in the body like fibromyalgia, and even to alcoholism and addictive behaviors. The first resource that made me aware of nervous system dysregulation and of different types of trauma and their impact is the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This book, I wish everybody would read this book. I think the world would be a better place if we all understood different types of trauma and the fact that many people around us might be dealing with these different types of trauma and the resulting dysregulation. This book really hit home for me, and I remember reading about how trauma survivors might have a difficult time making eye contact with people because trauma often involves the removal of autonomy at the hands of somebody else. Unfortunately, it can make it really hard to connect with people and feel safe with them. Even if you know them, the nervous system might be doing a whole other thing, trying to protect you. So it's fascinating to me to read about that in The Body Keeps the Score. And it led me down the path of researching dissociation, which is when a trauma survivor might sort of leave their body or leave the conversation. If you've ever had a moment where you've spaced out in a conversation and you're not sure what the other person just said, there's a chance that that could be trauma related and not feeling safe with that person or really anybody in general. These things happen on a very subtle level, so if you're not aware of it, don't feel bad about that. Or if you have been experiencing dissociation and you haven't been sure why, don't feel bad about that either. Some of this science is very new, but if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to read the book Coping with Trauma-Related Dissociation. It's fascinating. It has resources for survivors as well as for therapists. I think more and more therapists are beginning to become trauma-informed. I'm going to talk about therapy and also my personal views on trauma therapy as well as different trauma healing techniques in another video. If you're interested in learning even more about trauma, I really encourage the book Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine. That book is wonderful. It's all about how trauma is stored in the body and how animals actually shake off their trauma after, a fight, for example, and that humans have sort of learned over the years not to do that. So we might be storing trauma in the body that manifests as muscle tension, chronic pain, depression, anxiety, many other issues. Peter Levine is also very easy to find via YouTube. He's been interviewed by so many different people, and he really is a trauma expert. His work is fascinating. So please do check out his work if you're interested. There is another book on my list right now called It Didn't Start With You, and that is all about ancestral trauma or inherited trauma. It's possible that even if you may not have experienced a large trauma, your parents or your relatives have, and that actually may be affecting you, not only based on their behaviors and their trauma responses, but also based on the way that trauma changes our DNA and can be passed on throughout generations. So It Didn't Start With You is an interesting look at epigenetics and inherited trauma. I highly recommend that book. It's just super interesting. And lastly, the book Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker has been hugely instrumental in my own healing. I really recommend that book, especially if you have experienced lots of little t traumas or if you've grown up with abuse or addiction in the home. There's a workbook that is also called the Complex PTSD Workbook, and I think those two books go together really nicely. It's a great way to start journaling and sorting through perhaps some of the things that you have experienced. If you like the idea of working through trauma in a workbook, I highly recommend the book PTSD Workbook for Teens. Even though I myself am not a teenager, I love this book. I have actually done this workbook twice around 2 different traumatic events. And I think because it's geared a little bit towards younger people, the journal prompts are really gentle. The information is just really easy to understand. It's very accessible, and so if you want to work through some specific traumatic events in a pretty direct way, I highly recommend that book. If you're feeling really interested in doing kind of a deep dive into this information as I was, I found so much information via YouTube. There are some fantastic YouTubers talking about trauma. One of my favorites, who I admire her work so much, her name is Irene Lyon, and she's done a lot of work around neuroplasticity and the way that trauma changes our nervous system and changes our brain. She's also very well versed in the work of Peter Levine. Definitely check her out. Another YouTuber that I love is called The Crappy Childhood Fairy. She is awesome. Her name's Anna Runkle, and she talks a lot about childhood abuse and about complex PTSD. She just makes the information very accessible and actually fun to learn about a difficult topic. So highly recommend Crappy Childhood Fairy. Another resource for complex PTSD is the channel Complex PTSD Made Simple. Karuna, she's an amazing spiritual coach. I've done a few sessions with her and her work is so influential. She has some emergency meltdown, talk down videos that if you are experiencing a panic attack or a crisis moment, she will walk you through it via the YouTube video, and I have used those videos many times. I love her. Please check her out. You may want to poke around the channel Therapy in a Nutshell. It's not specifically devoted to trauma, but she does have a playlist of trauma and PTSD videos that are pretty helpful. They're short, easy to follow, and there may be some other information in that channel that speaks to you as well. I also really love Mark Freeman. He's a YouTuber who has spoken a lot about intrusive thoughts, OCD, obsessive thinking, and rewiring the brain. He's awesome. It's not specifically devoted to trauma, his channel, but really to nervous system disorders, and many of those do stem from trauma. So definitely worth a watch, and he has some really fun cartoons on there as well. If you are less into YouTube, but you like podcasts and listening to information, I highly recommend The Trauma Therapist. This podcast has almost 500 episodes. There are some amazing interviews in there. I have not listened to all of the 480 plus episodes, but there is some really amazing information, and I hope that you learn something in there that's helpful to you. Once you've done all of your trauma research and you're learning more and more about the ways that trauma is stored in your body, you may be wondering, how do you actually heal this trauma and heal the nervous system? Many of the resources that I've shared in this video do have suggestions and techniques for trauma healing, but I also will be posting part 2 of this video in which I'll be talking about many different trauma healing modalities and ones that worked for me and ones that didn't, and why. So if that's interested, I invite you to watch that next video. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'm supporting you on your trauma healing journey.